Blah. Ah!
So if you've seen my videos, you're probably aware of the fact that I use Linux on my computer. And you may also be wondering, what on earth is Linux? I just like the penguin in the thumbnail. For those of you in that latter group, Linux is a computer operating system, the same as like Windows or macOS. The difference being that Linux is free and open source, which I probably need to explain what open source is as well. To put it in simple terms, open source software is basically a program that anyone can view and edit the source code of. Like an image editor, but it's missing a feature you need, you can make it yourself and add that to your version. And if you think it's something that other people would want, you can even send that code to the main developer of the project and see if they want to add it into the main version. It's a really nice system for collaborative projects that get better the more people that get involved. But what does that have to do with computers? And that still doesn't explain what the heck Linux is. If you've ever used an Android phone, you've actually used Linux. Because it is open source and anyone can do anything with the code, Google actually used the Linux kernel as the foundation to build Android. And the stock version of Android is actually open source. It's called AOSP, or Android Open Source Project. This is what custom ROMs of Android like Lineage OS are based on. Linux is the same way. It was started by one guy, Linus Torvalds. He was a college student who couldn't afford, it was either IBM's Unix or some sort of similar Unix operating system that the college used. But he couldn't afford it. So what did he do? He made his own OS. You know, like a normal college kid between the drunken parties and questionable moral decisions. He then made the project public, and over time, more and more people started helping out with developing it, and now, 30 years later, we have what is literally the largest collaborative project in human history. The result? A computing operating system... The result? A computer operating system that gives Microsoft a run for its money. And it is... Read the script. The results? A computer operating system that gives Microsoft a run for its money, is free, is secure, and can be customized in almost any way you can possibly think of. So back to the main topic. Why do I use it? Isn't this some super confusing thing for nerds? Well, yes and no. Yes, Linux can be more confusing and it can be more technical, but that doesn't mean it has to be. With distributions, which I will be explaining in just a second what those are, distributions like Ubuntu, Pop! OS, and Elementary OS, you can use Linux without ever seeing the more technical side of things. Even Windows has its own terminal and stuff that you can use, but you don't ever see it because it's not needed. And most users don't need to use it, so why would they? It's the same thing for Linux. You don't need to use the more technical aspects, but they're there. Pretty much every single distribution of Linux comes pre-installed with a web browser, usually Firefox, an app center for installing the majority of software you'd need, settings menus in order to customize your computer to suit what you need. The only real adjustment is that when you download programs off the internet, if they're not in the app center, is that you'll need to download the link next to the little penguin icon. By the way, that guy has a name too. It's Tux. Now, here's where Linux can get a bit more confusing. Distributions. Usually this is shortened to distros. Distributions are basically the same as different skins of Android. If you've ever used an Android phone, you'll notice how Samsung, LG, HTC, and Google phones are all slightly different from each other despite them all running Android. Well, that's because each manufacturer makes small little changes to improve what they think their users will like. Linux is the same way. Each distro is the same kind of base, which is the Linux kernel and usually GNU systems, which that's a whole nother subject for a whole nother video, that is then modified to fit what they think their average user is going to want or need. For example, Arch Linux is for very tech-savvy people who want to control everything that's installed in their computer. It starts off with your terminal, and you install everything after that. Pop! OS, which is what I use, is geared towards making Linux as out-of-the-box, user-friendly as possible by having NVIDIA drivers set up for you, it gets software updates a little easier, and a couple other things. Elementary OS, for example, is for people who love the look and feel of macOS. It's made to look and feel the same way. Now, while distributions are great and they allow all of this amazing variety and finding an operating system that works just right for you, it does make switching over to Linux very confusing. To once again oversimplify things, which there will be a lot of in this video, please do not hate me, any serious Linux users. I'm trying to explain this in as simple terms as possible. From what I understand it, and granted I've only been using Linux for about a year, there's 4 main branches of Linux distributions. There's a lot more branches overall, but there's 4 main ones: Arch-based, Debian-based, Slackware-based, and Red Hat-based. There's a lot of actual different branches, and there's a whole chart going over what they all are and how they all connect. It's very convoluted, but we're gonna work under the assumption that most people watching this are not technically inclined or are very, very new to Linux. Arch-based distributions include things like Arch itself and Manjaro. Debian-based includes things like Ubuntu and anything based off Ubuntu, like Pop! OS and Elementary OS. Slackware-based includes popular distributions such as OpenSUSE or OpenSUSE. I think it's pronounced SUSE. I've never been certain on how to pronounce that. And Red Hat-based distributions are ones such as Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Fedora. For the purpose of this video, to make things as simple as possible, I will be mainly talking about the version I have the most experience with, which is Pop! OS, which is an Ubuntu-based, which is Debian-based. That's what I'll be sticking to. If you want to learn about Arch and those sort of things, I may make another video later. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Otherwise, I'm just going to stick to what I know. And if there are any Arch users watching this, I know that the Arch Wiki is a thing. It's basically like the Linux Bible. It is a fantastic resource, but it's not very user-friendly for newbies, unfortunately. It is a great resource once you are a lot more experienced and you're more into the technical aspects of things, but for newcomers, it's very intimidating. I will say that flat out. It's very intimidating for new users as someone who still considers themselves really a new user. Okay, with all that out of the way, I can actually talk about why I use Linux. I like customizing. Yeah, no, that's it. That's really the only reason why. The customization you can do on Linux is insanity. Rainmeter on Windows pales in comparison to KDE on Linux. Which KDE is a desktop environment. That's a whole other video. That will probably be coming. Maybe. I don't know. However, the more I started using Linux, there were some more things I actually started to appreciate over when I would use Windows. The biggest one being updates. Windows will randomly force you to update. Updates are good. Updates are something you should do. However, you should be able to choose when they happen. For me, it always happened as soon as it was available. My only options were to shut down an update or restart an update, and I could not delay it to like the next morning or something. I use a lot of different kinds of things plugged into my computer, and every time Windows had an update, it would break one of those things. So what I would typically like to do is I would have like 2 different programs to permanently block all updates, and I would keep updates blocked for about 2 months until I knew for sure it wasn't going to break anything, because usually by then, if there were bugs, they came out with a patch update as well. By that point, I could then update and everything would be fine. But to do that, I always had to be 2 months behind on updates, which was not the most secure thing to do. Now, updates in Linux will never be forced. It will never happen. In fact, I actually updated my system while I was recording this video. If that tells you anything. A lot of updates for Linux don't need a reboot. They have what's called a live kernel, where it can be edited and updated as it's running. Now, this isn't always the case. Occasionally you will need to reboot, but it's a much rarer occurrence compared to at least Windows. Whenever Linux has an update, you'll get a little notification letting you know that an update is available. And that's it. You can dismiss the notification, you can go ahead and update then, you can wait till later. It's completely up to you. That being said, please do update. If you do start using Linux, please update. Always keep your system as up to date as you can. Just update at a time that is most convenient for you. But do keep your system updated. Another thing is privacy. And yeah, I know everyone in the world of Linux goes, Microsoft is spying on you, but it really is. There's legitimately a keylogger built into Windows for Microsoft to see how you're using your keyboard or seeing what you're typing in search results. That's not okay. Granted, you can turn that off now, but initially when they added it, you couldn't. So, is kind of freaky. A lot more people are becoming aware of just how much data tech companies have on them, to the point that it feels kind of creepy. Like you have a stalker following you and learning things you never wanted anyone to know. Linux doesn't have that, and if a distribution does, it's always less invasive and always optional, and 9 times out of 10 it's disabled by default. You have to manually opt into it. Plus, since the code is open source for Linux, you could, in theory, download the source code, edit anything out that you don't want, and then compile the code for yourself. Granted, that is a very advanced thing to do, but it is an option that you have available. Now, despite all of this, I don't think Linux is the no-compromise replacement for Windows or even macOS. For example, if you need Adobe or some sort of other paid professional software and you can't get away with either an alternative or being able to run it in a compatibility mode on Linux, like through Wine, then you'll probably need to stick to either Windows or Mac. By the way, video and alternative software coming soon, hit subscribe. Another thing is that if you play online games with anti-cheat, they pretty much always see Linux as cheating. I don't know why, but they do. It's very annoying. In those sort of situations, I would recommend what's called a dual boot, or at least considering. Basically, a dual boot is a way to have 2 operating systems on one computer, and when you turn on your computer, you get a little menu asking you which one you want to boot into, Windows or Linux, or macOS or Linux, depending on what your computer is. It's a little bit more of a cumbersome system to get set up on a Mac as far as I know. Windows is a bit easier. Overall, the installation is not hard, just weird and confusing if you've never done it before. Now, while Linux is free and is much easier to use than people give it credit for, again, as I just mentioned, the actual installation is a bit of a hassle. It's not difficult, especially if you've ever installed or reinstalled Windows yourself. But for the less technologically inclined people, it can get very confusing very quickly. So at the end of the day, should you use Linux? Yes, absolutely. Should it be the only thing you use? Well, that depends. A lot of tools on Windows can be used on Linux thanks to compatibility tools like Wine, or if you are running Steam games, Proton. But it's not perfect. If you ever have a free day and you have a spare USB stick that's like 8 gigabytes or more, give it a try. Download a Linux distribution, run something like Etcher or Rufus, and write a Linux ISO to that USB stick and try it out. You might end up liking it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, hit that like button, also subscribe, hit that bell to get notified. Let's try that again. Well, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, hit that like button, also subscribe, hit the bell to get notified of any new uploads, and you may want to do that as I am working on new videos every week. And make sure you follow my social medias down below. If you want to see more of me, I stream on Twitch every Sunday through Wednesday, where I play JRPGs and other anime and story-based games, so I hope to see you there.